Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrilla.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Soldaten Schabes at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is timely. It's right before Tisha B'Av, the 9 days, so we take on more serious or sad or tragic topics. And of course, anything related to the Holocaust fits into that category. So today we'll talk about the death marches, a important story and very misunderstood story in the context of the Holocaust, focusing obviously on the death marches at the end of the war, the marches that the SS forced concentration camp inmates to undertake from concentration camps in the East towards concentration camps in Germany. That's the death marches that we're referring to. Now, the reason it's an important topic is because in the collective memory of the Holocaust, it seems to have made quite an impact. Survivor testimonies are full of descriptions, usually incredibly awful descriptions, of the death marches, the cruelty, the sadism, and the tragedy that took place on the death marches. And also the fact that it's very much misunderstood. What were the Nazis' goals? Why did they do the death marches? When did they do it? What was the purpose of it? And even more than that is that we have very, very little framework in which to discuss it. Most Holocaust-related topics, at least me personally, I discuss on my trips. Which comes up in pretty much any country we go to. If it's a trip to Prague, then we go to Theresienstadt. If it's a trip to Hungary, then we talk about the deportations and the Budapest ghetto and the shoes on the Danube River. And if we're going to Poland, we're going to the Auschwitz death camp and concentration camp, and Majdanek and other places. If we go to Germany, then we go to concentration camps there. So there's always there's what to talk about. The death camps, there's no specific site. There's no place to go to discuss it. And the death marches. Did I say death camps by mistake? Death marches. The death marches, there's no specific place to discuss it. There's no location. Well, there are locations, and just we don't usually go there. So it's an opportunity to discuss a on one hand, a well-known topic, but on the other hand, a not-so-well-known topic. When did it take place? We're talking about towards the end of the war. From the summer of 1945, it kind of gets going, but really towards the end of 44. Towards the end of 1944, it gets going. Really, it's over the winter of 1944, 1945. So the end of the year 1944, the beginning of 1945, and it takes place in concentration camps in the East, in Poland, and the Baltic states, and the marches that the SS lead concentration camp inmates from concentration camps in the East towards the West, towards concentration camps in Austria and in Germany itself. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of prisoners over the course of this year. They were, by different accounts, it may have been as many as 300,000, maybe even more, 350,000 prisoners. These death marches took place over weeks of time, sometimes hundreds of miles. Each death march was different, obviously. Each group of prisoners was different. The means of transportation were very often marching on foot. Sometimes they were transported in trains. Very often it was both. It was walking, marching until a train station, till they got to some train station that there was a train available, and then they were transported on a train, and then they were taken off that train at another train station, and then they were again marched to the destination camp. So it was both. Sometimes it was even in trucks. What types of prisoners? We're talking about concentration camp inmates. Now, towards the end of the war, many of the concentration camp inmates were Jews. So they were very often Jewish concentration camp inmates. They were by no means were they exclusively Jewish prisoners, because the concentration camp system was not created for Jews. The concentration camp system, the reason that we associate the concentration camps with the Holocaust is because most of those who survived the Holocaust and told us their stories, our grandparents and general Holocaust survivors in the community, were survivors of concentration camps. But if we looked at the Holocaust, the final solution, the Holocaust objectively on the outside in a very macro view, so the concentration camps plays almost no role in the Holocaust whatsoever, because the final solution was to exterminate the Jewish people, was to kill them. And therefore, the story of the Holocaust is the death camps, the gas chambers, the shooting pits in the East, where Soviet Jews were killed, and so on and so forth. That's the story of the Holocaust. That's the story of the final solution. In the early years of World War II, the concentration, and even before, the concentration camps were primarily used for Jews altogether, because the final solution was to wipe out the Jews, was to exterminate them. Most of the inmates of concentration camps were non-Jews. All kinds of political prisoners and Poles and resistance, members of the resistance in Poland and other countries, Soviet prisoners of war, all kinds of asocial elements of society that the Nazis felt needed to be imprisoned, and so on, in many, many, many categories. Of course, there were Jews as well. There were always Jews in concentration camps as well. But they were a minority for most of the war, because the Jews, the purpose was the final solution, to kill them all. So they were only, some of them were lucky enough, so to speak, even though the concentration camps were definitely not a lucky place. But once Stalingrad happened, once the Nazis were losing the war after the Red Army victory in Stalingrad in February 1943, so the pragmatic war goals of having workers in factories and slave labor, they very often overcame the ideological goals of the final solution, and therefore the more and more Jews were imprisoned in concentration camps towards the end of the war. By the end of the war, one can say that the majority of prisoners the inmates, the prisoners in these concentration camps were Jews, because they needed more and more slave labor. So by the time the death marches take place, so a majority of the prisoners, if we say that, let's say 350,000 concentration camp inmates were sent on these death marches, it's likely that about 250,000, in other words, 250,000 out of 350,000, again, these are not exact numbers, these are rough estimates, were Jews. So a large majority of the inmates on these death marches were Jews. So that's what leads us to the death march story. Now, death marches are a common use of torture throughout history. It's not that the Nazis invented them. Of course, the Nazis' cruelty and rate of death is much, much higher than any other death march in history. The Nazis always knew how to do things more extreme, more cruel, and more deadly than anyone else. But death marches can mean something very general, right? Some people may refer to the Trail of Tears of the United States government and military did to the Native Americans in the mid-19th century to force Native Americans across the Mississippi River. That might be referred to as a death march because many died along the way. Maybe even the Middle Passage of the slave trade was similar to a death march. In the Armenian genocide, the Ottoman Turks, they perpetrated against the Armenians from 1915 to 1921 with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So the Armenian genocide, which killed 1.5 million Armenians approximately, they began with death marches of the Armenian population, men, women, and children, to camps where they carried out massacres and all kinds of other things. So they had death marches there as well. And then if we come to World War II itself, Imperial Japanese, they did that to the Chinese during the war and to American prisoners of war, violating the Geneva Convention. The Bataan Death March was the Japanese doing to American soldiers who had surrendered after the fall of the Philippines towards the beginning of the war between Japan and the United States, end of 1941, beginning of 1942. Many American soldiers died or were outright killed by the Japanese during these terrible death marches. So this happens in other countries around the world through history. And of course, the Germans did it to others too, at different stages of World War II. It wasn't only the concentration camp inmates at the end of the war. The Germans did it to Poles in the beginning of the war. They did it to Soviet prisoners of war in the second half of 1941, when over 3 million Soviet Red Army prisoners of war were captured by the German invasion, the Wehrmacht invasion of the Soviet Union. Most of those 3 million Soviet prisoners of war did not survive till the end of the war. They either died of starvation, they died during death marches, or they're outright killed by the Wehrmacht who perpetrated war crimes. Again, no Geneva Convention on the Eastern Front, and they were wiped out. In fact, there were also death marches specifically done to Jews early in the war. In the Lublin area, in the Nisko area, there were marches that the Nazis forced Jews on death marches in 1941. You're talking about early in the war. So we're not talking about these stories. Our focus on this podcast is on the end of the war, when the Soviet advance, the Red Army's advance in the last year of the war, made it that they were coming towards liberating the concentration camps in the east, in Poland and the Baltic states primarily, or in the areas of the Soviet Union that were being liberated by the Red Army. And therefore, the SS, who ran the concentration camps, they evacuated the concentration camps ahead of the Soviet advance, ahead of the Red Army's arrival, and they led the inmates on these death marches. That's what we're focusing on, second half of 1944 and the first half of 1945. The death marches was that one area of the Holocaust which was never really understood by researchers. What were the Nazis thinking? Why did they do it? What were their goals? When did they decide? What was the purpose of this all? Why was there such a high death rate? What do they want to do with the prisoners of these survivors of these death marches when they arrived in concentration camps in Germany? It was something that was really not understood until recently. A professor at Hebrew University, Professor Daniel Blattman, who I know, and I heard lectures on this topic from, and of course he's got this excellent book and has written several papers. This is his baby. This is what I think, in one of the lectures I heard from him, he told us that he spent 10 years researching this. He is the one who really opened up this topic and discovered and explained, really, rather, to the world what the death marches were about, at least from the Nazi perspective. What were they trying to do? So a lot of this is based on Blattman's research, and he explains that there were really three main reasons that the SS carried out the death marches of inmates of the concentration camps in the last months of the war. The Red Army's advancing, and they're going to liberate these concentration camps very soon. So the Nazis wanted to remove the live prisoners from the concentration camps before the Red Army came to liberate these camps. Why? Number one, because the German plan, their plan, delusional plan, we got to say, but the delusional plan of Hitler, the Wehrmacht, the German army, and Nazi Germany in general was that one day we'll eventually stop the Soviet advance. Now, after Stalingrad, especially after the Soviet offensive at Kursk, their victory in the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in world history, so the Soviets were unstoppable. The Red Army never lost for the rest of the war. They were just advancing, and very often rapidly advancing. The German lines were indefensible. They were just in a very steady and sometimes very often a very speedy retreat across the Eastern Front. So there was no chance that the Wehrmacht was going to win the war and eventually stop the Red Army. The Red Army was unstoppable from in the last year and a half or so of the war, last 2 years of the war. So that was delusional. But they hoped that when they got to the borders of Germany, the fatherland, Deutschland itself, the borders of the Reich itself, not occupied Eastern Europe, but the actual old borders of the Third Reich, then the Wehrmacht would rally and they would finally stop the Red Army's advance. That was the plan. And that was what Hitler wanted. And therefore, in order to mount this defense of the fatherland, in order to mount to finally stop the Red Army at Germany's borders, they would need munitions factories, tank factories, railroad fixing. They would need tons of slave labor, loads, enormous amount of slave labor to do all the work for the German army to stop the Red Army. And therefore, all these concentration camps with tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of concentration camp inmates who are skilled labor, who can be used for slave labor, they would need them in factories in Germany in order to stop the Red Army's advance. That was number one. So the number one reason why they led the inmates of concentration camps out before the Red Army could liberate those camps and set all these prisoners free is because they would need them, or they thought they would need them, or they were deluded themselves into thinking they would need them in Germany itself. That's number one. Number two is that the Nazis did not want, the SS did not want any live witnesses to be able to testify and relate the story to the Red Army liberators regarding Nazi atrocities. And if they would leave a couple of 100,000 living witnesses to tell them, this is what the Nazis did, this is what these gas chambers were for, this is what the tortures were all about, this is what this was all about, this was the starvation rations, and they would just have this enormous amount of material, of live witnesses telling the stories of Nazi atrocities. And they didn't want any of those people to fall into the Red Army's hands. So usually, if this comes up with the groups and they ask me, so why didn't they just kill everyone? That would leave also too much testimony to Nazi atrocities, because since the Red Army was advancing very quickly, they would not have time to wipe out the evidence of their killing. They would not have time to wipe out the evidence of their crimes, should they have decided to kill everyone in the concentration camps. And therefore, when the Red Army would come and liberate the camps, they would find piles and piles of bodies. And that would be a living a big visual testimony to the Nazi crimes and atrocities. So the SS wanted to cover their tracks. Let's remove all the prisoners alive, bring them to concentration camps in Germany, and this way they will not have any living witnesses to tell the Red Army about Nazi atrocities. That is reason number two that the Nazis, the SS, decided to carry out the death marches. Number 3, the third reason is really only relevant on the last months of the war, in the last camps within Germany itself, is that the SS felt that if the Red Army would liberate camps and let all the concentration camp inmates free, then they would go all over the countryside and create mayhem on the German population. They would steal, they would spread disease, it would just be total mayhem, violence, and chaos on the German Aryan population. And therefore, to prevent this chaotic situation on the German civilian population, the SS led the concentration camp inmates on death marches further into Germany, further away from the Red Army. Now, that last third reason was really for the last months of the war, when we're talking about death marches from concentration camps in Germany itself, not really so much about the concentration camps in the east towards the concentration camps in Germany. So the first two were the more important and fundamental reasons. So that's the reasons that the SS decide to carry out the death marches. The question is, if that was the goals, then if you lead them on marches on foot for tens, if not hundreds of miles, without food, without shelter, in the winter of 1944, 1945, and most of them die on the way, and the ones who survive to make it to the end, to come to these concentration camps in Germany, they're not capable of working in any factory. They're skin and bones, they're skeletons, they're walking skeletons. How in the world is this going to help your war effort? How in the world is this going to help remove the witnesses from the Red Army regarding Nazi atrocities? You're leaving the dead of the death marches along the way. They're spread all over the Polish countryside and the German countryside. Everyone sees the corpses. Everyone sees these people dropping dead. Everyone sees their bodies afterwards. And then, of course, the survivors are living to tell the tale. They're going to tell the Red Army just a few months later. What's the difference? And even the ones that you brought into Germany, they can't work. They can't go to factories because they just went on these terrible, horrifying death marches, and they're just skin and bones. So what did you accomplish? So even though we just said 3 reasons that the SS had, but their execution of the policy of the death march itself it negated the goal. It's the goals that they had set for themselves. So it doesn't seem to make any sense. And here what we actually have is a perfect illustration of the breakdown of communication, the breakdown of the famous Nazi orderliness. And that's because of a few reasons. First of all, the breakdown of the hierarchy of communication between Berlin, where the SS headquarters were, and the SS leadership in local regional offices, and the SS officers and commandants of specific concentration camps in the field, who are actually facing the Red Army's rapid advance. So this discrepancy, in other words, Berlin gave orders, and, the Nazis follow orders. The SS are big order followers. Whatever the senior commanders, SS leadership in Berlin says, we got to follow orders. Now, the Berlin orders didn't make sense by the time they came to be translated into the field because of the rapid advance of the Red Army. But they carried out the orders. So the orders were to evacuate the camps, even though by this time it didn't make sense, even though they weren't provided with trains, so they had to march them in the snow, which made no sense. But the SS commandants carried it out because Berlin ordered, and Berlin didn't realize what they were doing because they're in Berlin, and they don't see the Red Army advancing, and they don't see how long the preparation is needed to evacuate properly. They need to give out extra rations. They need to provide trains. None of that was provided. Extra clothing for going in the snow, for going in the cold. None of this transportation logistics was considered, and therefore there's a complete breakdown in communication and execution on the logistical side, on the technical side of things. So all this together creates a situation of complete mayhem within the SS, within the hierarchy of the SS, from Berlin, down to the officers who are carrying out the death marches in the field, in the concentration camps itself, and are trying to organize these last-minute evacuations without the technical and logistical capabilities of doing so. So that is the breakdown. And part of the reason for that is because the Red Army was advancing in the last year of the war much faster than expected. In the summer of 1944, just at the same time that in the West was the invasion of Normandy, which is much more famous, but Operation Bagrazia was the greatest advance of any army in history, as far as I know. In other words, the largest territorial occupation, largest territorial conquering or liberating, depending on who you ask, in the history of warfare was the Red Army in the summer of 1944, Operation Bagrazia, where they advanced through the entire Belarus, most of Ukraine, eastern Poland, part of the Baltic states, all in one summer. It was an incredibly rapid, really advance that caught the German army by surprise. The German army's in full retreat, and no one could keep up with the speed of the Red Army's advance. And the Eastern Front is moving in the last year of the war very, very quickly. And what happens is, in July 1944, a very important event happens. July 1944 is the liberation of Majdanek concentration camp outside of Lublin in Poland. And the Red Army advance on eastern Poland, like I said, had been so quick. The SS did not have time to destroy the evidence of mass murder in Majdanek. When we go to Majdanek today, the gas chambers and crematorium are still fully intact. It's the only place, the only death camp that you can actually see the original gas chambers and crematorium ovens, authentic from that time, from the liberation of the Red Army. At the time, the barracks were still there. Everything was still completely intact. Ashes in the crematorium ovens, because they had advanced on Lublin very quickly. The SS did not have time to blow up the gas chambers and crematorium like they did in other places, like they did in Auschwitz, like they dismantled the entire camps, completely wiping out all the evidence, like in the Reinhard death camps, such as Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor. And therefore, the Red Army liberates the camp, and it's there. All the evidence is there. Everything is there. The warehouses are full of all the stolen materials. Everything is there. And this was a big problem as far as the SS was concerned. The Red Army invites journalists, not only Soviet journalists, American and British journalists. A few weeks after the liberation of Majdanek, pictures and live journalist reports to newspapers and radio in the West, in America and in England and other countries in the world, are being reported from Majdanek in the summer of 1944, while the war is still raging, about the liberation of Majdanek, about the SS atrocities, the Nazi atrocities, the death camp, the gas chambers, the crematorium. By the end, a couple of months later, in the fall of 1944, there's already the Museum of Majdanek, which we go to till today with the groups, is already opened by the Soviets. The museum is up and running, already having tourists come in the middle of the war. It's already up and running. Why? Because the Red Army wanted to showcase, the Soviet government wanted to showcase, this is Majdanek, this is what the SS, this is what the Nazis did, and this is what the Red Army is liberating from the great heroes, the great Soviet communist heroes. They're liberating the world from Nazi Germany. Now, the SS takes big lessons from Majdanek. They said, Majdanek shall not happen again. No way are we going to allow a concentration camp to fall into the Red Army's hands like what happened with Majdanek. And therefore, the other great concentration camps, small and large, especially the large ones like Stutthof in northern Poland, outside of Gdansk, Danzig, and of course Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of all, and then Gross-Rosen, which was in eastern Austria, Evacuation orders are that all these three camps all the archives should be burned and destroyed. The gas chambers and crematoriums should be destroyed. The records of the camp should be destroyed. The entire camps should be evacuated. All the live prisoners, death marches. No one should be there when the Red Army comes. And this is given out in like an emergency, and there's this complete breakdown of orderly evacuation, and that's the resulting catastrophe. Because there's not enough trains to take them. There's not enough rations to give out. There's not enough manpower to make this an orderly march. And therefore, they're just let out of the camp and marched hundreds of miles to not even sure where they're going initially. And eventually they're told to go here. Then they switch the direction and they're told to go here. There's going to be a train available. They can stop in this camp on the way. This camp was recently evacuated to bring them here. And that's what happens. So the death marches themselves, we said hundreds of thousands participated, and many, maybe even most in some cases, are either die or get killed along the way. Again, this is the winter. They're very often let out with just their concentration camp inmate uniforms, those striped uniforms that they were issued in the camp. Sometimes they grabbed a blanket or something on their way out, but very inadequate clothing. Barely any extra rations. Sometimes they were given an extra loaf of bread, which was supposed to last them for weeks. Many of the testimonies speak about how they never had a shortage of what to drink because they simply took the snow that was around them and they drank that. That was used as what to drink. Many of them were suffering from typhus or other injuries or beatings that they had sustained, disease, and therefore tens of thousands are either die along the way, just collapse from fatigue, from exhaustion. They're forced to march at a steady pace, at fast paces for hours and hours on end. They're weak, just collapse from weakness, just collapse from exhaustion, from starvation, from whatever disease is racking their body. And very often they're shot and killed by SS, people who lagged behind, people who were holding other people back. If they didn't keep up the pace, the SS were very free with shooting people along the way. So between those who died along the way and between those who were killed along the way, it's impossible to have exact numbers, but we know that tens of thousands were died or killed along the way, maybe even in the hundreds of thousands. We don't know for sure. Where are these people buried? Sometimes they were just left in the snow. Sometimes you had instances where local Poles in villages along the way, sometimes it was even local priests who just felt bad that these bodies were along the road on the way and they wanted to give them a proper burial, so they gave them an honorable burial very often along the way. Sometimes they were never buried. Sometimes their own friends and family were able to, during the night, those who had perished and were not able to get up the next morning, they gave them a temporary burial. And with the people with their last strength, they buried those who had not made it. And these are some of the worst times, some of the worst starvation. There's even stories about cannibalism that took place on the death marches. Very, very tragic, desperate situations. Sometimes prisoners tried to escape. Where were they going to escape to? Starving in the middle of the winter with no shelter, with no food. It was really, really a desperate situation. So I want to spend the next few minutes that we have to relate a few stories from death marches. And there's a lot of powerful stories. Some of them are famous, some of them are less famous. But I think that the death march stories have a very, very, very impactful, very powerful. Some of them. There's stories with the Kloisenberger Rebbe, Rabbi Kusil Yehuda Halberstam, the Heilige Kloisenberger Rebbe, who survived the Holocaust, survived several concentration camps, lost his wife and 11 children, and he survived the death marches as well. So there's quite a few stories about him in general, and specifically on the death marches. There's one, for instance, where he told everyone to dig for water, and they miraculously found water there to be able to quench their thirst. So, that's a nice story. But for me, the best story that I have about the Kloisenberger Rebbe on the death march is that he said, and he would repeat this later in life to his followers. He said this several times later in life. He said that he misses the death marches. How could someone possibly miss the death march? The Klausenberger Rebbe explained that he missed the death march because everyone looked the same. Everyone was wearing the concentration camp inmate uniform, the striped uniform. Everyone was clean shaven and had their heads shaved in the camp. Everyone looked exactly the same. When the Klausenberger Rebbe said when he was marching in the death march, he did not know if the person next to him was a Rebbe, was a simple chassid, was religious or secular, was a wealthy or poor, was educated or was simple, a water carrier or an engineer, was a doctor or a beggar. They had no idea how religious someone was. Was he a chassid or a misnagid? Was he anti-religious, or was he fanatical religious, or was he anything in between? You couldn't tell. Everyone was the same. Everyone was in step together. Everyone was marching together. Everyone realized they're all the same. And he said, I miss that. I miss that we all saw each other as the same, as just another human being. Not that we're judging everyone by how they look and what their beliefs are and who they are. He said that's what we do today, and we did not have that in the death marches. A great story. Another story I heard, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan in Gibraltar, who I believe is still alive. I hope he is. He lives in Bnei Brak, as far as the last time I checked. A very special Yid, who wrote a 3-volume book about his experiences in the Holocaust, primarily in the Kovna ghetto, but later on in concentration camps as well, and in the death march. And he describes in the death march he was still with his father. He and his brother were still with their father, and his father was getting weaker and weaker, and they didn't know what to do. They were supporting him and helping him get along, and it was getting more and more challenging and more difficult. And finally, the father says, "Leave me be, leave me behind." And they said, "No, we'll never do that for you. We can't leave you. We're taking you with us. We're going to make sure that you survive. We're going to make sure that you live. We're going to make sure that we're together, and we're never going to leave you. We're never going to abandon you." And the father knew that if the kids stay behind and make sure to schlep him, then all 3 of them are going to get killed, because eventually they're just going to falter. They're going to weaken. They're either going to be shot by the SS guards, or they're all going to collapse where they are. And the only hope of his son surviving is if he tells them to leave him behind, the elderly father, the weak father behind. So he starts yelling at them. He says, "I'm telling you, as a father is giving a command to his son. You know the mitzvah of kibbud av v'aim? This is my last command to you. You want to do the mitzvah of kibbud av v'aim? Listen to me. Leave me behind." And Yitzchak Elchanan in Gibraltar said that he did not know what to do. This was the ultimate moral dilemma of his life. He didn't know if he leaves his father behind, and he's listening to his father because his father's demanding that he leave him behind, and he's telling him, "Kibbud av v'aim, leave me behind." So he's listening to his father, but he's leaving his father behind. How could he do that? How could he abandon his father just to save himself? So if he stays with his father and he doesn't abandon him, doesn't neglect him, then he's doing what he feels is the right thing, but his father's telling him, "You're doing the wrong thing because I'm telling you, don't stay with me." And he said he didn't know how to solve this dilemma. And eventually they were able to pull off to the side, and they were able to survive somehow. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is this horrible dilemma that he has. There's a very famous story. I don't even know who it's with. It's like too famous to even know. It's the church steeple story. It's almost a cliche story. Everyone says it over, and I don't even know the names. If someone knows the names of the people involved, then I would love to know it. But it's one of the best stories about the death marches, and it's so relevant for day-to-day life. And the church steeple story is very simple, is that someone was falling behind, giving up, weakening, fatigue was kicking in, and he was ready to give up. And someone next to him said, "Don't worry, just hold a little bit longer. You see that church steeple in the distance? And of course, a church steeple was in every single Polish town on the countryside. And that was the only thing you could see. It was the tallest building in each town. So that was the only thing you can see from a distance. So he pointed to the upcoming town, the church steeple, and he said, that's all we have to get to. We have to get to there. And if we get there, you'll be safe. You're going to remain alive. You can make it to the next church steeple. And they get to the next church steeple. And again, he's weakening again. And they continue walking, of course. And the guy says to him, just to the next church steeple. Just to the next one. Just to that, then we'll be okay. And that's what kept him going. And this fellow, survived to tell the tale. And the point is that when it's endless, when there's no light at the end of the tunnel, when it's too far, when it's too vast, when it's too distant, when it's too overwhelming, then you give up. But if it's just incremental, it's small steps, it's just to the next town, just to the next church steeple that you can actually see in the distance, you can see the achievable goal, it's not that far, it's not too insurmountable, then the challenge can be overcome. And that's what got him to survive. That is another classic story of the death marches. Another one of my favorites, and he just passed away a year ago. I think it's his yard site. I think he passed away on Tisha B'Av or somewhere near there. David Leitner, a Hungarian survivor, religious man. He was known as Dugo here in Israel. He lived here in Israel. Fascinating guy. Hungarian Jewish survivor, a lovable personality. He had this phenomenal sense of humor. He actually, because of a whole story, he was in Auschwitz, he got a number in Auschwitz, and then he was transferred out of Auschwitz to another labor camp, and then when that labor camp was evacuated, he was brought back to Auschwitz a second time and actually got a second number. There are a few people like that. I know a few survivors who are like that, people who got two numbers. So when people would ask him why he has two numbers, he would make a joke about it. He would say, I heard there was a mivtza. They were giving out two for the price of one. So I said, hey, why not? I'll take two. So Dugo is a great guy, a wonderful person, a lively personality. And on January 17th, 1945, is when the Nazis evacuated Auschwitz. The 10 days before the Soviets, the Red Army, liberated Auschwitz. On January 27th, 1945, which is today International Holocaust Day, because of the liberation of Auschwitz, symbol of the Holocaust. So 10 days before that, on January 17th, the SS evacuated over 60,000 prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau on death marches. And on that day, Dugo was one of those prisoners, and he went on the death march. And the way he was able to survive the death march was he was starving. He didn't have any food. And he remembered his mother, who had been killed in the Holocaust. His mother had told him that if you survive the war, when you survive the war, you should go to our ancient historical homeland, to the land of Israel, to Eretz Yisrael. And when you go there, they were starving. His mother told this to him in the ghetto or whatever it was. They were hungry, and I'm probably messing up the story, but this is the story we tell over on January 17th every year, because he made it into like a yontif. He said, and you go to that land, and they have, and there they're going to give you food. There you'll have food. There you won't be hungry anymore. There you'll finally have food. You'll be able to eat to your heart's filling. And they have these little bilkalach, she told him, these little round bilkalach, some sort of food that you'll be able to eat. And that's what will fill you up, and you'll never be hungry again when you get to Eretz Yisrael. And this is what kept him going. When they went on the death march, and he's starving, every step of the way he thought of what his mother told him. And he said, every step that I'm taking is a step closer to the end of the war, a step closer to liberation, a step closer to getting to Eretz Yisrael, and a step closer to eating those bilkalach, those little round bilkalach that my mother told me about. And that's what kept him going. That's what kept him alive during the death march, thinking about this as like a mantra during that whole time. And when he finally gets to the end of the war, he survives, and he comes to Israel, and he's in the Machane Yehuda Shuk. It's not making it up. This is how he would tell the story. And he's in the Machane Yehuda Shuk, and he sees falafel for the first time. And he sees these little round falafel balls, and he says, hey, these are the little round bilkalach that my mother was talking about. Whether his mother was talking about that or not, nobody knows. But he says, this was it. This is those round bilkalach. And he says, this is the food that kept me alive. And this became his favorite food. And in his later years, he made like this public media, social media in his later years, almost like it to this social media movement where January 17th every year became Falafel Day throughout Israel. And he would go to schools, he would go on TV, he would go on the radio, he would meet with dignitaries and celebrities and the president of Israel and everyone, and he would eat falafel. He would sponsor hundreds, maybe even thousands of falafels for school kids all around. And he became this thing that on January 17th in Israel, you eat falafel in honor of Dugo Falafel Day, about remembering this story. In fact, I personally partake in this yontif. I buy falafel for my family every year on January 17th to remember Dugo and his story. And I think it's a very great story. And you don't have to do this custom in your house. In fact, if you live in the United States, maybe you shouldn't, because falafel there is, not so great. At least the ones that I had in America. But if you're in Israel, you can. There's some good falafel here. And that's another great story. So there's another, we ran out of time, but if you have a chance and you want to do over Tisha B'Av, you want to really see probably the best description of the death marches that I've ever seen, is Elie Wiesel in his classic Night. Everyone has Night of Elie Wiesel. It's one of the most famous Holocaust books ever written. He has about 20 pages on the death marches towards the end of the book, obviously, and his vivid descriptions. It's horrifying descriptions. It's harsh. But they're so powerful, and they're the best description of the Death March I've ever read anywhere, and highly recommend it. If I had time, I would have read a few of the best passages here on the podcast. We would have had story time with Yehuda Geber and Jewish History Soundbites, but we ran out of time, so I'm not going to do that. But if you have a chance to read it, you should. I'll end off with a question. So, having said what we said, can we say that the death marches are part of the Holocaust or the final solution? And if no, does it matter? In other words, we said, based on Blattman's research, that this was kind of like a mistake, the whole thing. It wasn't supposed to be these death marches. It wasn't supposed to come out that way. It was because of a combination of factors of what the SS goals were and about the SS, the German war plans were, and the Red Army's advance was, and logistics and technicalities, and that's what ends up being the death marches. So maybe it's not really part of the final solution, really in quotation marks. Maybe it's not technically really part of the Holocaust or the final solution. But to me, it doesn't really matter, because ultimately the SS facilitated this situation. The SS, in their cruel, sadistic way, did not care for the prisoners, and for whatever the reason was, they led them out on these death marches. They led them out without the proper conditions, without trains, without rations, without proper shelter during the winter. They're the ones who shot them when they faltered. They're the ones who carried out this terrible atrocity, which is the death march, and therefore it's just as much part of the Holocaust and the final solution as everything else, even though it was not exactly the intended goal of the SS. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.